be associated with menopause, things like that. So I guess what my question is should we assume implicitly that it's going to be downhill if this kind of testing goes into the commercial sector? Is it possible that in some instances it might actually be better?
Yeah, so one of the other things that your question brings to mind is that in fact our notions of what not just the genetics, but the diseases themselves are also changing over time. A good example of that is when I was in medical school, cystic fibrosis was thought to be a totally catastrophic illness that was in the same category with Tay-Sachs disease or some of the really, really nasty diseases of childhood. Well, it's actually a lot of people are surviving into their 40s and 50s now with cystic fibrosis, not because of anything in genetics, but because we've done a better job of treating with antibiotics and getting the muck out of their lungs. And it's not, to the people who have it and live with it, it doesn't feel like a catastrophic disease when they wake up in the morning. And yet that's the concept that was presented to those of us who were doing genetic counseling back in the 1970s and 1980s. So it's a mismatch between what we think of as the disease itself. So we might have had the genetics right, although we didn't. It turned out there were hundreds of variations of cystic fibrosis too, but let's say we had. We still were wrong about the disease itself because we were assuming it was always going to be as bad as it was. So lots of things like that are happening all the time. So our conception of the disease itself may be changing. And we do have a tendency to, at least initially, over-amp the value of the genetic information. I do think we have that tendency. The only thing I can say about that is I think we have to trust social processes to kind of deal with that. The example you gave of the oophorectomy, I would hope that's a pretty medical problem. If somebody's getting an oophorectomy and they don't know that they're going to have menopause after that, that's not actually a problem of genetics. That's a problem of communication between whoever's doing the oophorectomy and the person who's getting it. That's not a surprise, and that wouldn't have been a surprise in 1940 either. So that's not the genetic stuff. That's just stuff that shouldn't happen. So, yeah, very back.
What do you think is the perspective of the role of family physicians in this knowledge that's coming out? When the serious genetic diseases, as you talked about, the geneticists and the genetic counselors are really playing the biggest role in getting that information to the family and staying into the family and dealing with the consequences. With the wide availability of this knowledge, this information now, it won't be just the geneticists that will be learning that knowledge. Every doctor out there will have to have some knowledge of this or that.
Yeah, so I think we're going to see a continuation. What's really become much more the reality over the last decade and a half, which is all of medicine is becoming much more genetic in its thinking, but at the same time genetics is becoming less Mendelian in how it thinks. And that's just happening. The one thing I would say about primary care physicians, we don't have very many in the United States, but the ones that we do have are going to be the ones who are dealing with people walking in the door with their genomes on a disk. And I don't think the solution to that is to teach them a lot of Mendelian genetics, which is how we teach genetics now. That's not going to help them. But they do need to deal with the patients who are walking in the door with these reams of genetic risk factors. Again, I think they're going to have to be one step ahead of their patients. That's really the only choice they've got.
So they need to understand the technology and
Yep.
explain the limitations.
Although I have to tell you, they don't need to understand the DNA sequencing technology. What they need to know is the interpretation of the data that are coming out of it. And the thing that I am worried about, that your question raises to mind, is one of the problems with having this on the corporate model is, what do we know about that model? We know that there are strong incentives not to share all the bad news about the underlying flaws in the technology. That's just the way we sell products. There's just a very strong counter incentive to share knowledge about the bad things that can happen. One of the problems with the way that we're presenting this to the world now through these technologies is we've got that built into the system. And I don't think you're going to see Navigenics and 23andMe explaining to the world the really worst things that can happen if you buy their product. Yeah.
So just comment on that comment, I guess. I'm a medical
And the other thing is, those genetic counselors are getting training about Mendelian genetics. The information they're going to get from 23 and Navigenics, that knowledge does not help them translate this. The only way you're going to be able to translate what Navigenics and 23andMe are doing is to know how they're reaching the interpretations that they're reaching and be able to explain to your patient that's in front of you what that means for them. And in fact, where is that information coming from? It's not coming from Mendelian genetics that you get taught. It's coming from all these GWAS studies, and there are 5 of them coming out every day. And you actually need computers telling you what's the newest information about blah, 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 that feeds into the database in the first place. That's what you need as your primary care tool. If you're seeing these patients in front of you, you need to be able to go to a computer and say, and it's going to be a computer, it's not going to be an expert, it's going to be a computer because the data are going to be flowing into computers about the studies that are being published that week. So you need a tool that can explain to you what the meaning of the data is. And what you're going to need to know is how are they constructing the interpretations at these companies. That's what you're going to need to know to explain it to your patients. Right?
And is it being framed from a worker perspective in terms of a bias perspective, or is it being framed in terms of a really best interest patient perspective? So I guess the question to you is what do you suggest that we do? Because I kind of see this, if it's actually a scenario that we have all this information for 5 years and anyone can look at it, I mean, how are we going to be able to educate primary care physicians and deal with this?
I'm not going to answer that. You got to help me. I really don't know how this is going to play out. I truly don't. I do think that's where we're going to find ourselves. But it's not going to be just GWAS studies. It's going to be a whole lot more, way more complicated information that's flowing in out of fire hoses.